Okay, so thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to Ada and Eleanor for being wonderful mentors and just people in general. So this is a replication paper called How Well Do My Results Generalize Now? And explores the external validity of online security and privacy surveys. So this is based on a paper by Alyssa Redmiles, Sean Cross, and Michelle Mazurek called How Well Do My Results Generalize? And based on data collected in 2017, they explored the generalizability of Amazon Mechanical Turk, or MTurk, to the US population in terms of security and privacy behaviors and experiences. And they found that MTurk was relatively generalizable for most things, such as advice sources, experiences, and feelings of knowledge. But it was not generalizable for questions about behaviors, possibly because the people on these platforms tended to be a bit more tech savvy. They also found that generalizable populations on these platforms tend to generalize well for those under 50 or with some college education. Now, 2017 was 5 years ago, and a lot has changed since then. So welcome to How Well Do My Results Generalize Now, 2022 edition. And so how have the online platforms that people use for surveys changed since 2017? Researchers still use both MTurk and Prolific, though Prolific has become ever more popular recently. It was not commonly used in 2017, but now seems to be more popular than MTurk. And we've also seen a drop in quality from MTurk data, possibly because of an increase in the number of bots on the platform. So this leads us to a few questions. Firstly, can we replicate prior results about the representativeness of MTurk to the US population in terms of security and privacy surveys? And we ask a similar question for Prolific. How well does Prolific generalize to the US population? Before we go any further, let's talk a bit about generalizability. Right? Ideally, we'd be able to survey everyone in the United States, including Hawaii and Alaska, and get them to tell us their security and privacy behaviors and answer our questions. That's first really expensive and also not possible. So the state of the art used by major organizations such as Pew are called weighted probabilistic samples. So they make sure to recruit hard-to-reach populations, such as those who are older, not as tech-savvy, or don't have internet, and they collect data that, after weighting, is within a few percentage points of the actual US population demographics. Now, these kinds of large-scale probabilistic samples are still not feasible for most security and privacy researchers. They take a lot of time and a lot of money. So we turn to things like MTurk and Prolific. And so the question is, okay, so how well did these platforms generalize? And to answer that, we did a qualitative analysis of questions asked by security and privacy research in the last year and identified 5 major categories of questions. The first one is behavioral questions, so actions users take, so what they do, would do, or have done, such as their social media use. Do you use Facebook? The second type of question were experience questions, so whether or not certain events or experiences have happened to the user. So has someone taken over your social media or email account? The third type was knowledge questions. So we defined these as those that have factually correct answers. So for example, what does it mean to have a privacy policy? And the way we asked these, there was 1 correct answer, 3 to 5 incorrect answers, and a not sure or I don't know option. There's also perceptions questions. So these are opinion questions about attitudes such as trust, comfort levels, mental models. So for example, how comfortable people feel with certain uses of their personal data. And finally, there are beliefs questions. So these are more norms-based about what should or ought to be true. So should Americans have the right to have certain types of data deleted? And so we identified a survey conducted by Pew Research Center that had questions in all 5 of these categories. And from each category, we took 4 to 8 of these exact same questions and asked them again on MTurk and Prolific to compare the answers from these platforms to Pew's samples answers. So let's take a look at our data sets. So the Pew Research Center data we didn't collect ourselves. It was the gold standard to which we compared our answers from the online platforms because that's the closest we have to the American population's ideas. For MTurk, we collected 800 samples and we limited it to those in the United States with above a 95% approval rate and over 50 completed tasks because that's the general default that most people would use. for decent quality data on MTurk. For prolific, we have two samples. So the first one is the gender balance sample. And so we chose a gender balance sample rather than a raw prolific sample. Prolific sample, pardon me, because in fall last year, there was a viral TikTok, and it caused an influx of young women to go to prolific. So even now, I believe there's around 2 times or 3 times as many women as men on the prolific platform. And Prolific was like, oh, this isn't great because we're a survey platform. So to mitigate this, they implemented a feature called Gender Balance, which is available to researchers at no additional cost that gives us equal numbers of men and women when you deploy your survey. So that makes sense for people to use as the default. And lastly, we have the prolific representative sample, which the platform also offers. And it is generalizable to, it is representative of the US population in terms of age, sex, and race. And in terms of the time it took to collect our data, the gender balance sample and MTurk sample are quite similar, around 2 hours, whereas the representative sample took quite a bit longer. Similarly, in terms of cost, the MTurk sample and gender balance sample are similar, whereas the representative sample cost more. So let's take a look at how these things performed. On the y-axis, we have each category of question we asked and how well each sample performed in each category. On the y-axis, we have total variation distance, or TVD, which measures how far each sample differs from Q on a scale of 0 to 1. So this is a measure of distance. Smaller is better, as the arrow indicates. And so if you get 0, that means your sample's answers were identical to Q's answers. And what we see here are the prolific samples perform similarly well in terms of generalizability, whereas MTurk doesn't perform as well. Now, this is raw data, and most of us are not going to be using raw data, right? We're going to be using attention checks, weighting, and things like that, which leads us to another question, right? What are the effects of data quality measures on generalizability? And based on that, what are current best practices for online surveys? And so our data quality checks include reading attention checks. So this one is select the correct multiple choice answer. We tell you which one it is. This one is the free response text question. So we ask users to type in their own responses to what is digital privacy. And finally, CAPTCHAs. This one is click the traffic light. Yeah. All right. We also look at the effects of weighting and breaking. So as you can see here, the data on prolific skews very young. And so on a very high level, weighting is a statistical technique that reweights data to match the proportions of your target population, in this case the US population, in certain categories. And the categories we chose were age, education, race, and sex. So using these data quality checks, we found that over 39.1% of our MTurk sample failed the text box attention check question. So when they were asked to type in an answer to define data digital privacy, over 300 people failed. People, bots, whatever. No one really failed our CAPTCHAs, but most people passed the other attention check, which was the select the correct multiple choice, which seems to imply that bots are getting ever more sophisticated. Less than 1% of either prolific sample failed the text box attention check. So given this, we wondered what happens in a best case scenario. So what happens if we restrict the results to those who are under 50 or with some college education, which are known to be generalizable populations, if we remove people who failed any attention check and we apply weighting? And so this is what we have again. Once again, lower numbers are better because they mean these match closer to the Pew results. And we see that the MTurk data quality improves significantly, right? Though it's still a bit worse than the best case prolific data. Also, similar to findings from prior work, the categories of questions are not similarly generalizable. In particular, behavior and knowledge do not seem very generalizable, whereas experiences, perceptions, and beliefs are. So, in summary, what did we learn? Overall, it seems that both the prolific representative and gender balance sample are fairly similarly generalizable, and so it'd be up to researchers to determine trade-offs between time and cost. In terms of MTurk, the best case scenario does fairly decently, and it is still so much better than a raw MTurk sample. We find that for certain categories, particularly experiences, perceptions, and beliefs, online platforms do tend to generalize fairly well, whereas for things like behavior, particularly social media use and knowledge, they do not, perhaps because people who use these platforms tend to be more online or more tech savvy. If you believe that your sample might have a lot of bots, we do suggest text box attention check questions over other types of attention checks. This seems to have the best effect on data quality. And in terms of weighting and ranking, we didn't find that for MTurk this had too much improvement in generalizability, but perhaps that's because we have to decide on what categories to rank on, and we didn't weight on things like text savviness, et cetera, which might be important. So overall, researchers can definitely learn a lot of useful information from online privacy and security surveys, but we have to be aware of the limitations, whether it be from platforms, populations, or just the types of questions we ask. Thank you.